3.5 pages, one war, 5 days that changed everything, and a silence so loud it became the story. Experience. My name is Rachel Meadow, and what I'm about to show you is not a theory. It's not speculation. It is a documented timeline, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stay with me until the end, because if this video disappears, you'll know exactly why. Let's go back just a few months. November 2025. Something extraordinary happened in Washington, something that millions of Americans had been demanding for years. President Trump signed into law the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and almost immediately, the Department of Justice began releasing documents. Not a handful, not a summary. We are talking about nearly 3.5 million pages, 2,000 videos, 180,000 images, 3.5 million pages. Think about that for a moment. That is not a file. That is an archive. That is a universe of secrets that someone somewhere spent decades trying to keep buried. The first release landed like a bomb. Social media exploded. News channels scrambled. People were finally going to get answers about Jeffrey Epstein, about his network, his clients, his island, his black book. But here's the thing about releasing documents in Washington, D.C. The devil is always in the details. And the details were almost entirely blacked out. Attorney General Pam Bondi made quite a show of it. She invited pro-Trump social media influencers to the White House. They were handed binders, literally labeled The Epstein Files, Phase 1. There were cameras, there was fanfare, there were bold headlines. But when investigators and journalists actually opened those binders, page after page after page, redacted. Entire sections blacked out, whole paragraphs erased. Critics immediately called it theater, a performance, a reveal that revealed almost nothing. And yet, the public's appetite was insatiable, because they knew there was more. There had to be more. And they were right. Fast forward to March 5, 2026. The DOJ dropped a second release of Epstein files. But this batch was different. This wasn't just names and financial records. This was testimony, sworn witness accounts. And buried inside those pages was something the White House was absolutely not prepared for. The FBI had conducted interviews with a woman who made a direct, specific, and documented allegation. She claimed that Donald Trump had sexually assaulted her when she was between 13 and 15 years old. She said she had been introduced to Trump by Jeffrey Epstein himself. Now, the Department of Justice itself acknowledged these documents had been improperly withheld. They had been, quote, mistakenly marked as duplicative. In other words, someone inside the system had flagged them in a way that kept them out of the original release. Whether that was deliberate or accidental, that is a question investigators are still asking. The White House moved quickly to respond. President Trump flatly denied any wrongdoing, and the DOJ itself issued a statement saying some of the documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims. They distanced themselves from the content, even as they released it. But it didn't matter. The documents were out, the allegations were on record, and the internet was on fire. Google searches for Epstein files hit an all-time high. Cable news was scrambling. Independent journalists were combing through every single page. This was shaping up to be the biggest political story of the year. And then, something happened. Something that changed everything. February 28, 2026, 6 days before the second Epstein document release, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran. They called it Operation Epic Fury, and it lived up to that name. Airstrikes rained down on Iranian infrastructure, military installations, command centers. According to Iranian officials, more than 1,300 people were killed. Among them, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself. The world stopped. Every news network on the planet pivoted. Every journalist, every analyst, every pundit, they all turned toward the Middle East. The airwaves flooded with military correspondents, satellite images, geopolitical experts. Iran was burning, and the story was everywhere. And the Epstein files? Gone. Not physically gone. They were still there, still public, still available. But functionally, they had vanished from the conversation. The second release, which dropped on March 5th, received a fraction of the media coverage that the January release had generated. Within 48 hours, The story had been completely swallowed by the war. Independent analyst Shail Ben Ephraim, a former Israeli diplomat, told Al Jazeera it point blank, Trump really needs a distraction. He pointed out that Trump's approval numbers at this point in his term were among the worst he could recall in modern presidential history. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where the timeline starts to speak for itself. Let's walk through this slowly, because every single date matters. November 2025, Trump signs the Epstein Files Transparency Act. First release of documents, heavily redacted. The public is promised more. January 30th, 2026, first major document drop. Social media explodes, but the most damaging material is missing, flagged as duplicative inside the DOJ system. February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury against Iran. The world's attention shifts immediately. March 5, 2026, the second Epstein release drops, this time containing the FBI witness testimony naming Trump in connection with underage assault allegations. But global attention is consumed by the Iran war. The story barely registers. 6 days. The war began 6 days before the most politically explosive Epstein documents were released. And those documents, the ones with direct, named allegations against a sitting president, landed in a media environment that had no bandwidth left to process them. Now, you might be asking yourself, is that a coincidence? Could the timing be explained by bureaucratic delay? Could the DOJ have genuinely not known what was in those documents until after the war started? Those are fair questions, and we should ask them. But we should also ask this: who inside the DOJ flagged those documents as duplicative in the first place? And when exactly were those flags reviewed and reversed? And why did 50,000 files quietly disappear from the public database in the weeks before the second release, with zero explanation? These are not fringe questions. These are the questions that Congress is now asking out loud. Here is something that almost every mainstream outlet buried in the back pages. In a rare bipartisan move, members of Congress voted to subpoena Attorney General Pam Bondi directly. They demanded she appear and testify about the DOJ's handling of the Epstein files. Both Democrats and Republicans signed on. That is not normal. That almost never happens at this scale. The top Democrat on the committee noted something striking. The DOJ announced its latest document release the day after the Bondi subpoena vote was passed. Not a week later, not a month later, the very next day. And those 50,000 files that had quietly disappeared from the database, the ones taken down without any public explanation, they were at the center of the committee's questions. Meanwhile, Republican Congressman Thomas Massie, one of the legislators who had actually helped pass the Epstein Files Transparency Act, took to social media with a message that cut straight to the point. He wrote, PSA, bombing a country on the other side of the globe won't make the Epstein files go away. Read that again. A Republican, a congressman who helped write the transparency law, publicly accusing the administration of using a war as a distraction. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is an elected official making a documented public statement. And it turns out, the American people are paying attention. A survey of over 1,200 likely voters conducted between March 6th and 8th, just days after the second document release and the peak of the Iran war coverage, asked a simple question. Do you believe Trump was at least partly motivated to attack Iran to distract from the Epstein scandal? The result? 52% said yes. More than half of all likely voters in America believe their president may have started a war, in part, to bury a scandal. Among Democrats, the number was 81%. Among independents, 52%. Even among Republicans, 26% said they believed distraction was at least a partial motivation. Now, I want to be precise here. A poll is not evidence of wrongdoing. Public opinion is not the same as proof. But it does tell us something profound about where trust in government currently stands. It tells us that more than half the country looks at this timeline, this specific, documented, date-by-date timeline, and sees something that does not feel accidental. And that matters, because public trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. Now, and I want to be transparent with you here because you deserve the full picture, This story has also attracted a wave of disinformation. Pro-Iranian social media accounts began amplifying the distraction theory almost immediately after the war began. Fabricated videos circulated. Misleading posts racked up tens of millions of views. Some falsely claimed to show Trump with underage girls. Those posts were lies, fabrications designed to inflame. And that matters, because when deliberate disinformation attaches itself to a legitimate story, it makes it easier for those in power to dismiss the entire narrative as conspiracy. It muddies the waters. It gives bad actors plausible cover. So let me be clear about what I am presenting to you tonight. I am presenting you with documented facts, verifiable dates, congressional records, sworn testimony, public poll data, official government statements. I am not asking you to believe fabricated videos. I am asking you to look at a timeline, a real, sourced, documented timeline, and decide for yourself what it means. Now, in the interest of fairness, and because I believe you deserve a complete picture, let me give you the counter-arguments. Some analysts push back hard on the distraction narrative. They point out that Trump has long had loyal media allies who were already minimizing his Epstein connections before the war began. They argue he didn't need a war to suppress the story. The machine was already working. They also point to independent strategic motivations for striking Iran: oil interests, regional geopolitical pressure, long-standing tensions with Tehran that predate the Epstein story entirely, Iran's nuclear program, proxy conflicts, the broader arc of U.S. Middle East policy. There's also the uncomfortable reality that Iran's escalating aggression in the region gave military planners legitimate cause for action, with or without any domestic political calculation. And then there's this, the rising cost of the war itself. With U.S. oil prices approaching $4 a gallon as a direct result of the conflict, the political blowback was becoming a liability for Trump, not a relief. If the war was designed as a distraction, it was also generating its own set of problems. These are legitimate points. They deserve to be part of the conversation. But here's what none of those counter-arguments can explain away. The documents that named Trump were sitting inside the DOJ system, flagged as duplicative, while the first release was celebrated as transparency. They only surfaced after someone looked more carefully, after the subpoena vote, after public pressure, after independent investigators started asking the right questions. Coincidence? You decide. 3.5 million pages, one war, 5 days that connected them, and a silence that should never have been allowed to fall. Here is what I know to be true. The Epstein files are not going away. Congress has issued subpoenas, journalists are still digging, witnesses are still talking, and the documented timeline, the one you've just seen, is public record. No one can erase the dates. No one can unrelease the testimony. No one can pretend the 50,000 missing files were never noticed. The record exists. And as long as there are people willing to read it, willing to share it, willing to demand accountability, it will not be buried. If this video gets removed, and I have reason to believe it might, you'll know why. Screenshot the timeline, save the dates, share this with everyone you trust. Because in a world where wars can drown out documents and redactions can replace transparency, the most radical act you can perform is simply this. Pay attention. I'm Rachel Meadow. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next one.